Hospitals are supposed to heal. They're filled with light, with life, with the sound of footsteps and monitors, proof that someone's still fighting. But when the night shift begins, everything changes. The air feels heavier. The corridors stretch longer than they should. And sometimes, in the quiet hum of machines, you realize you're not alone. It was around 3 a.m. when I saw her, a little girl, no older than 8, walking barefoot down the main corridor. She wore a white dress, the kind that looks like something from another era, with lace at the sleeves. I was at the nurse's station, watching the security monitor. For a moment, I thought maybe she was one of the pediatric patients. But then I remembered pediatrics was in the East Wing, and that wing on the screen had been closed for over 5 years. The girl walked slowly, her head tilted slightly, almost like she was listening for something. She stopped right under one of the ceiling lights, and then she looked straight into the camera. I swear, I felt her eyes meet mine through that screen. Her mouth opened, like she was trying to say something. Then she turned toward the door at the end of the hallway and vanished. I called security. They checked the entire wing. Every door was locked from the outside, just like always. When I replayed the footage later, she wasn't there. The hallway was empty the whole time. Another night, a patient in his 80s passed away at 2:17 a.m. Peaceful, quiet. We'd been expecting it. His vitals had been fading for hours. We cleaned the room, noted the time, covered him gently, and stepped out. 10 minutes later, the call light for that same room went off. We looked at each other, laughed nervously, maybe someone hit the wrong button. We reset it. 2 minutes later, it went off again. The sound echoed through the hallway. I went in. The bed was still empty. The button was unplugged from the wall, but the red light on the call panel was glowing. We tried everything, turned the system off at the circuit box, unplugged the console, it just kept lighting up. Until sunrise. At exactly 6:01 a.m., the light turned off by itself. No one touched it again. That room stayed empty for months after. We had a supply room in the basement, the oldest part of the hospital. No one liked going down there. It smelled of dust and disinfectant, and the lights flickered like they were tired of working. The corridor outside used to lead to the psychiatric ward before it was shut down. One night, I went down alone to restock saline bags. The air was freezing. You could see your breath if you exhaled. As I turned to leave, I heard someone whisper my name. Not loud, just close. Right behind my left ear. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me not to look back. But I did. Nothing. Just the flickering light and the sound of my own breathing. I walked faster, my heart pounding. Then, just as I reached the stairs, I heard it again. Emily. That's my name. Security checked the camera feed the next morning. They said the motion sensor triggered twice in that same hallway, but the footage was blank. Just static. Some nurses believe hospitals have their own rhythm. When death walks the halls, something changes, like the building knows. One of my coworkers noticed that every time a patient was about to die, the lights in their room would flicker for a few seconds. At first, we joked about it. The lights are saying goodbye. But after it happened 6 times in 1 month, no one laughed anymore. One night, we were sitting in the break room, talking about it. She said, "I swear they flicker when a soul leaves." Right as she said it, the fluorescent bulb above us buzzed and flickered 3 times. None of us spoke. The room went dead silent. From that night on, she refused to sit in that room after midnight. There's an old long-term care wing in our hospital that's been closed for years. Paint peeling from the walls, broken tiles, equipment left behind. We pass by its double doors every night. Sometimes you hear things, faint footsteps, the squeak of a gurney wheel, the sound of someone coughing. But the scariest thing is the shadows. You can see them move under the gap between the doors, like someone walking slowly on the other side. But the lights in that hallway were removed years ago. Maintenance swears the electricity is completely shut off. Still, every once in a while, the motion detectors inside will blink red, and the system logs will show activity detected, 3:12 a.m. No one ever goes in to check anymore. The doors are chained shut, but sometimes, when you walk past, you could swear you hear someone whispering just beyond the metal. On the cardiac ward, room 14 changed how I see night shifts. The patient, a quiet man in his 70s, kept telling us a visitor came at midnight. A man in a gray suit who never spoke, just stood by the bed and watched. We blamed the meds, charted the behavior, and moved on. But the night he died, the motion sensor camera in his room picked up activity at exactly 12 a.m. A shape darker than the room itself standing by the rails for 20 seconds. No staff entered, no doors opened. At 12:21, he coded. When I was a student nurse, they trained us in the old annex, a building no one had used in years. They warned us, don't take the elevator, it sometimes sticks between floors. Halfway through the session, we heard the ding. The doors slid open by themselves. Inside, there was only a gurney with a yellowing sheet and a child's handprint smeared on the back wall, as if someone had pressed from the inside and slid down. The instructor said, "We're taking the stairs." No one argued. A coworker of mine refused to do discharges after 2 a.m. She said she once wheeled an empty bed into room 9, turned to grab a blanket, and when she turned back, an elderly man sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at his hands. She greeted him. No response. She stepped closer, and the sheets were perfectly flat. The bed was empty. She left the room and never went back in alone. We have a small chapel that stays open all night. It's meant to be a calm place. Wooden benches, a box of tea candles, stained glass over the far wall. Around 4 a.m., on certain nights, multiple candles will ignite at once. No one inside, no timers, no drafts. Maintenance searched every system. Chaplain said it's a kindness. Now, when a patient passes, some of us leave one extra candle burning, not for the soul leaving, but for the ones left behind. In ICU, I saw something I still can't explain. We lost a patient after a long battle. We cleaned the room, documented the time, pulled new linens tight. I sat down at the station with the door in my line of sight. The monitor inside the room disconnected. Empty bed chirped to life with a flat line, and then produced a slow, steady heartbeat. No one had touched the leads. No one was inside. 10 seconds later, no alarms logged. We just stared at each other, and nobody said a word. There's a door at the end of our oncology hall that leads to a storage closet. Handwritten sign, keep shut. If you stand there past 3 a.m., you'll hear what sounds like a child humming, a hushed looping tune with no beginning or end. Security checked the ceiling ducts, the plumbing, even the electrical panel. Nothing. Once, I pressed my ear against the wood and heard the hum stop, then a gentle, careful knock from the other side. 3 beats. I never stood there again. On palliative, we call it the last goodbye. Sometimes a patient who hasn't spoken in days will sit up suddenly, eyes clear, voice strong, and ask us to open the window. Even if the window doesn't open, they'll smile at a spot over our shoulder, whisper a name, and then lie back down like they were never awake. Hours later, the room is quiet forever. We write it off as a surge of clarity, an end-of-life phenomenon. It doesn't make it less real when you're the one holding their hand. One winter night, the generator flickered and the whole building sighed. Emergency lights painted the corridor a dull red. From the far end, we heard wheels turning a slow, uneven squeak like an old wheelchair. We assumed transport was moving a patient, but when the light stabilized, the hallway was empty, and the fresh tracks in the dust led straight to the locked fire door and stopped. No prints turning around, no smears, just an end. In the pediatrics wing, a set of paper cranes hangs from a string by the window. They were folded by the families over the years. On calm nights, they barely move. But during codes, while we're rushing past, they'll spin hard enough to tangle, even when the air is still. A resident swears he saw one crane unfold mid-turn and refold itself, the creases crisp and new. I didn't see it, but I've untangled that string enough times to know something makes them dance. There is a smell you never forget, the mix of antiseptic and old books in the records room. I was pulling charts at 2:40 a.m. when a file dropped behind me. It lay open to a name I knew, a patient we'd lost that afternoon. As I picked it up, the wall clock ticked, backwards, 3 clicks, then forward again. The second hand never stuttered after that, but I signed my initials and left without finishing the pull. On oncology, Room 23 had a reputation. Not bad, just watchful. Nurses would chart in the doorway because the motion light inside would trigger if you crossed the threshold. But sometimes, as you wrote, the sensor would light on its own and you'd hear the shift of linen in the dark. We used to say the room liked to know who was coming. When facilities finally refurbished it, fresh paint, new bed, modern sensors, the behavior stopped. The door, however, still swings open a few inches, around 3/7 every night, then closes softly like someone changed their mind. I covered one shift in a rural hospital with a tiny morgue, basically a cold room with metal drawers. The latch on the far left unit was broken and would rattle when the compressor cycled. We ignored it. That night, while I was finishing notes, the rattle became rhythmic. Tap, 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 like the slow beat of a finger on steel. When we opened the room, the sound stopped and the air felt colder than it should. We fixed the latch the next day. The tapping never came back, but I still hear it in my head whenever the hallway goes quiet. Sometimes it isn't the supernatural. Sometimes it's the weight of memory. I once held a woman's hand as she described the garden outside her childhood home. The stone path, the smell of tomatoes, a swing that creaked on hot, windless days. She asked if the garden here had a bench and if I could open the blinds so she could sit with the red flowers. There were no flowers outside her window, only a concrete wall and a floodlight. She smiled anyway, relaxed, and was gone a minute later. I still check that window at dawn. It's always just brick. There's an abandoned long-term wing with chained doors in our hospital. Paint flaking, ceiling tiles bowed, glass dark with dust. On my last rotation down there, I paused and listened. A rush of air moved through the hall like a sigh. Then, faint footsteps, heel, toe, heel pacing behind the far door. I told myself it was settling metal, the building breathing. As I turned away, something whispered from the crack between the doors. Not a word I could understand, just the shape of one. It followed me halfway back to the elevator. Not every story ends with fear. Sometimes the quiet is kind. A patient asked to hear her favorite hymn, but the speaker wouldn't connect. I hummed the first line off key and apologized. Somewhere down the hall, someone picked up the melody. Another voice, then another, until a thin, human chorus threaded through the ward. No one ever admitted it later. Maybe it was only the vents carrying sound from a late-night service in the chapel. Maybe it was something else. Either way, she smiled and said, "That's enough." And it was. Hospitals are made of lights and machines and rules, but also of last breaths, kept promises, and the echo of names spoken once, then never again. You don't have to believe in ghosts to feel that weight. You just have to work a few nights and listen. I was in the basement at 3 a.m., grabbing a new stretcher, cold concrete floor, humming pipes, that fluorescent buzzing you can almost feel in your teeth. Suddenly, something tugged the back of my scrubs gentle, like a child. I froze. Then, right next to my ear, a little voice whispered, "I'm lost." My blood ran cold. When I turned around, no one was there. The security footage later showed me standing completely alone. But right before I turned, there was a tiny flicker on the camera feed, a white blur about 3 feet tall, moving behind me. Another nurse told me she saw a man in black standing over her patient's bed. Tall, wearing a trench coat, wide-brimmed hat, boots completely still. She blinked, and he was gone. The patient flatlined 30 seconds later. No one ever found an explanation, but every time someone mentioned it afterward, the lights in that room would dim, just slightly, like he was still listening. One night during my residency, I saw a black shadow enter a hospice room. No light source, no reflection, just this thick, shifting darkness sliding across the floor and up the bed. The patient didn't die right away, but he passed the next morning. When I checked the motion detector logs, it recorded activity in that room at 3:12 a.m., exactly when I saw the shadow. I was working in a psychiatric ward. One of our patients screamed in the middle of the night that there was a man with a bag over his head standing at the end of her bed. We rushed in, nobody there, but the temperature in the room had dropped nearly 10 degrees instantly. Even the walls felt cold to touch. The next day, an older nurse told me that 10 years earlier, a patient in that same room had suffocated himself using a plastic bag. The call light stories are endless. This one's mine. A patient had died earlier that week, peaceful, family by his side. We sanitized the room, stripped the bed, locked it. But for the next 3 nights, the call light went off same time, 2:44 a.m. The system was unplugged, the wires removed. On the fourth night, one of the nurses finally said out loud, "John, this isn't your room anymore. You can rest now." The light blinked twice and never turned on again. In the ICU, we sometimes saw a woman in scrubs walking ahead of us down the hall. She'd turn the corner into the break room we'd follow immediately, and the room would be empty. No second door, no open window, just the smell of antiseptic and lavender perfume. The older staff swore she was a nurse who died during a night shift decades ago. No one has used that break room after midnight since. Once, a patient swore a beautiful nurse gave her her meds. She described her perfectly blue uniform, dark hair, gentle voice. But the nurse she described had died years earlier in a car crash. When the staff checked the med cart, one blister pack was missing, exactly the kind that nurse used to prepare every night shift. Another time, the camera in the pediatric ICU caught movement, a small shape darting across the hall. Looked like a child. Security called the floor, thinking maybe someone's kid was visiting after hours. But there were no visitors that night. And when they checked the video again, the figure wasn't there anymore. Only a faint reflection in the window, a child's face smiling. No patients matched that description. I once worked in a rural ER with long, echoing hallways and heavy wooden doors. Around 4 a.m., one of those doors slammed shut so hard the hinges cracked. But there was no one near it. Motion sensors didn't pick up anything. We reopened it the next morning, and carved into the inside wood was a single word: stay. No tools in the ER could have made that mark. It was burned into the grain. And maybe the strangest story came from an EMT. He said once, after dropping off a body in the morgue, he turned to leave and heard someone behind him whisper, "Thank you." He thought maybe it was another worker, but he was the only one there. He left the stretcher, ran to the elevator, and when the doors closed, the morgue light flickered 3 times, like someone was waving goodbye. Hospitals are filled with science wires, machines, medicine, but sometimes, between the hum of life support and the silence of death, there's something else, something that doesn't want to leave. And if you ever work a night shift long enough, you'll feel it watching you too. Thank you for watching and listening. Which story stayed with you the longest? If you've worked a night shift in a hospital or anywhere and felt something you couldn't explain, share it in the comments. Your stories keep this series alive. Take care of yourselves, and may your hallways stay bright, your nights stay quiet, and your footsteps always lead you back to the light.